Racist cop rips black woman's dress. Unaware she's the mayor's wife. The autumn air carried a hint of approaching winter as Lena Thompson stepped out of the community center, her heels clicking softly against the concrete steps. The charity gala had run longer than expected, but she didn't mind. These events always filled her with a sense of purpose, especially when she saw the direct impact on local families. Tonight's fundraiser for after-school programs had exceeded their goals, and the genuine smiles on the faces of the parents and teachers made every minute of planning worth it. Before we can continue, if you love your family, subscribe to this channel to help up creating amazing stories. Now, let's continue. She adjusted the strap of her clutch, deciding against calling her usual driver. The night was too beautiful to spend it in the back of a car, and the 10-block walk home would give her time to decompress. The streets of downtown were familiar territory, lined with trees sporting their fall colors and vintage lampposts that cast warm pools of light on the sidewalk. Her navy blue dress, a recent anniversary gift from Richard, moved gracefully with each step. She remembered his face when she first tried it on, how his eyes lit up with that same warmth she'd fallen in love with 20 years ago. The dress wasn't just expensive, it was elegant in its simplicity, much like the approach she took to her role as the mayor's wife. Groups of people passed by, some heading to late dinners, others leaving work. A few nodded in recognition, and she returned their greetings with genuine warmth. That was something Richard always said he admired about her, how she never played at being friendly. She genuinely cared about their city and its people, from the business owners who kept downtown thriving to the homeless man who always sat outside the library, whom she made sure got a hot meal at least once a day. The evening traffic hummed around her, punctuated by occasional horns and the distant wail of a siren. She passed the old theater, its marquee lighting up the block with promises of upcoming shows. The window of Mario's Pizza still glowed invitingly, and the smell of garlic and tomato sauce brought back memories of late-night dates with Richard before he entered politics. Lena checked her phone, finding a message from Richard. "Hope the event went well. Don't work too hard." She smiled, typing back a quick reply about the successful fundraising numbers. He worried about her taking on too much, but they both knew her community work wasn't just for show. While some politicians' wives treated charity work as an obligation, Lena saw it as her calling. She'd just finished responding to Richard when she noticed the first hints that something was off. The street ahead seemed emptier than usual, and the familiar comfort of downtown began to feel different. The shadows between buildings stretched longer, and the warm glow of the streetlights somehow felt colder. A police car crawled past, moving slower than normal traffic, and something in her gut told her this wasn't a routine patrol. Lena quickened her pace slightly, not wanting to appear nervous, but feeling increasingly uneasy. The clicking of her heels echoed off building facades, creating a rhythm that seemed to match her heartbeat. She'd walked this route countless times, knew every store owner by name, could tell you which buildings were up for historic preservation and which needed new tenants. This was her neighborhood, her community, yet something felt wrong. The sound of the police car's engine grew louder again as it made another pass. Lena kept walking, maintaining her composure while her mind raced through possible scenarios. Was there trouble in the area? Should she call Richard? No, she decided that would be overreacting. She was just a few blocks from home, and this was probably nothing more than routine police work. She passed the window of Chen's Alterations, catching a glimpse of her reflection. The dress really did look stunning, its cut and color perfectly suited for both the charity event and her natural elegance. Mrs. Chun had insisted on doing the alterations herself, refusing payment and saying it was the least she could do after Lena helped her grandson get into the summer youth program. The memories of tonight's event flooded back, the passionate speeches about creating opportunities for local youth, the generous donations from community members, the proud parents sharing stories of their children's achievements. Lena had spent hours working with the organization's board to ensure every detail was perfect, from the catering to the presentation materials. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was Sarah, her assistant, sending over preliminary numbers from the fundraiser. They'd raised enough to fund 3 new after-school programs and expand the existing ones. Lena made a mental note to start working on the implementation plan tomorrow. There was so much to do, coordinating with schools, hiring staff, ensuring proper oversight. The police car's lights suddenly flashed on, bathing the street in alternating red and blue. Lena's heart jumped, but she forced herself to remain calm. Years of public appearances had taught her how to maintain composure under pressure. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to go very wrong. The car pulled up alongside her, its engine idling with a low growl. Lena could hear the crackle of the police radio inside, could feel the weight of eyes watching her through the window. She continued walking, her stride purposeful but not hurried, her head held high as she'd learned to do through years of public life. The car door opened with a heavy click that seemed to echo off the buildings. Footsteps approached from behind, measured, deliberate steps that spoke of authority and purpose. Lena's instincts screamed at her to run, but her experience in the public eye kept her steady. She was Lena Thompson, the mayor's wife, a pillar of the community. She had nothing to fear from law enforcement. How wrong she was. Officer Dave Markham wasn't having a good night. 3 false alarms, a domestic dispute that went nowhere, and now this, a woman who didn't fit the neighborhood profile walking alone at night. He'd been on the force for 12 years, and he trusted his instincts. Something about her just didn't sit right with him. He stepped out of his patrol car, leaving the lights flashing. The woman stood there, poised and calm, but he'd seen that before. Criminals could be good actors when they needed to be. Her dress looked expensive, too expensive for this part of town, even if it was the nice end of downtown. Designer labels meant nothing these days, could be stolen, could be fake. "Ma'am," he called out, his voice carrying the authority he'd perfected over years of traffic stops and street patrols. "Can I ask what you're doing around here at this hour?" He watched her carefully, looking for the telltale signs of guilt, shifting eyes, nervous fidgeting, anything that might confirm his suspicions. The woman turned to face him fully, her expression composed but guarded. "I'm walking home from an event," she replied, her voice steady and clear. Markham noted her perfect diction, the way she held herself. It all seemed rehearsed to him, like someone trying too hard to appear legitimate. He moved closer, his hand resting casually near his belt. "Walking home," he repeated, letting skepticism color his tone. "From what kind of event?" The street was quiet now, the usual evening traffic having thinned out. A few pedestrians passed by, some slowing to watch the interaction, but most hurrying past, eyes averted. "A charity fundraiser at the community center," she answered, maintaining her composure. "It's just a few blocks back." She gestured vaguely in the direction she'd come from, but Markham wasn't buying it. He'd seen too many smooth talkers in his time on the force. "That's quite a dress for a community center event," he pressed, his eyes scanning the garment critically. The material looked genuine, but that didn't mean anything. "Where'd you get that?" The question came out more demanding than he'd intended, but he didn't care. Something about her calm demeanor was starting to irritate him. "It was a gift from my husband," she replied, a slight edge creeping into her voice. Markham caught it, that tiny shift in tone that always preceded resistance to authority. He'd dealt with enough situations like this to know where it was heading. A couple stopped on the opposite sidewalk, watching the scene unfold. Markham ignored them. He was doing his job, protecting the neighborhood from potential threats. If people wanted to judge him for it, let them. He knew what he was doing. "Your husband," he repeated, letting the words hang in the air. "And where might he be right now?" He took another step closer, asserting his authority through proximity. The woman stood her ground, which only made him more suspicious. Most people backed away when he did that. "At home," she said simply, but Markham could sense her growing tension. Good. Tension often led to mistakes, and mistakes led to the truth. He'd seen it countless times before, people cracking under pressure, revealing their true nature. The evening air had grown colder, or maybe it was just the tension making it feel that way. A breeze stirred the leaves on the sidewalk, creating a soft rustling that underlaid their conversation. More people were starting to notice the scene, their presence adding to the pressure building in the air. "You'll have to excuse me if I find this a bit hard to believe," Markham continued, circling slightly to his left. It was a tactical move, one that put her more directly in the light from his patrol car. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in this area." It wasn't exactly true, but it was a useful line he'd used before. The woman's eyes narrowed slightly. "Officer," she began, her voice taking on a more formal tone, "I don't understand what's suspicious about walking home from a charity event." She adjusted her clutch, a small movement that drew Markham's attention. "What was in that bag?" "Ma'am, I'm going to need to see some identification," he demanded, his patience wearing thin. He was tired of the games, tired of her composed responses that felt like challenges to his authority. The growing audience of onlookers only added to his irritation. A young man with a phone had stopped nearby, probably recording. Markham felt his jaw tighten. Everyone was a critic these days, ready to post their edited versions of police work online. But he wasn't going to let that stop him from doing his job. "May I ask why?" the woman questioned, still maintaining that infuriating calm. "I'm simply walking home. I've done nothing wrong." Her words were measured, careful, but Markham could hear the underlying defiance. It was always there with these types, a subtle resistance to authority that made his job harder than it needed to be. "This is a nice neighborhood," he said, emphasizing each word. "We need to make sure everyone walking through belongs here." As soon as the words left his mouth, he saw something flash in her eyes, anger, maybe, or indignation. Finally, a crack in that perfect facade. The crowd was growing larger now. Markham could hear whispers, could feel the judgment in their stares. But he'd been here before. People always questioned police work when they didn't understand the realities of keeping a neighborhood safe. "And what makes you think I don't belong here?" she asked, her voice carrying just enough edge to make it clear she understood exactly what he was implying. The question hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken accusations. Markham felt his patience snap. The woman's composure, the watching crowd, the whole situation was getting under his skin. He stepped forward, closing the distance between them with deliberate authority. "Listen here," he started, his voice dropping to a more threatening tone. "I don't appreciate your attitude." The confrontation was about to take a turn that would change both their lives, though neither of them knew it yet. The night air crackled with tension, and somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed, a fitting soundtrack for what was about to unfold. The space between Lena and Officer Markham had shrunk to barely an arm's length. The flashing lights from his patrol car cast alternating shadows across his face, making his expression shift between intimidating and almost demonic. His next move came without warning. His hand shot out, grabbing her arm with enough force to make her gasp. "I need you to prove you're not up to anything suspicious," he growled, yanking her closer to the patrol car. The sudden movement sent her stumbling in her heels, her clutch nearly slipping from her grasp. The indignity of the situation burned in her chest, mixing with fear and anger in equal measure. A small crowd had gathered now, their faces showing mixed expressions of concern and disbelief. A young woman with glasses pulled out her phone, holding it up to record the scene. Another person, an older man in a business suit, took a hesitant step forward, but stopped when Markham shot him a warning glare. "Let go of me," Lena demanded, trying to keep her voice steady despite the growing panic in her chest. "You have no right to handle me this way." She attempted to pull her arm free, but Markham's grip only tightened, his fingers digging into her skin hard enough to leave marks. "No right," he spat back, his face twisting with contempt. "I have every right to investigate suspicious behavior in my jurisdiction." His free hand moved toward her clutch, and Lena instinctively pulled it away, pressing it against her side. The movement seemed to trigger something in Markham. His expression darkened further, and he reached for her dress instead, grabbing the fabric roughly. "What are you hiding?" he demanded, his voice rising. "Empty your bag now." "Stop it." Lena's voice cracked slightly, her composure finally breaking as she felt the delicate material of her dress strain under his grip. The sound of tearing fabric cut through the night air like a gunshot, followed by gasps from the onlookers. A piece of the navy blue dress hung loose now, the careful stitching Mrs. Chun had done completely ruined. Lena felt exposed, vulnerable, but more than that, she felt a deep, burning rage building inside her. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every person who'd ever been treated this way, who'd been judged and handled roughly simply because someone in authority decided they didn't belong. "Hey, leave her alone," someone shouted from the crowd. More voices joined in, a chorus of protest rising from the gathering spectators. Phones were out everywhere now, recording lights blinking like artificial stars in the growing darkness. Markham's head snapped toward the crowd, his face flushed with anger and something else, perhaps the first hints of uncertainty. But he didn't release his grip on Lena's arm. If anything, he seemed to hold tighter, as if asserting his authority over the situation through brute force alone. "Back up, all of you," Markham shouted at the crowd, his free hand moving to rest on his weapon, not drawing it, but making sure everyone could see the implied threat. "This is police business. Interfere, and you'll be arrested for obstruction." The crowd shifted uneasily, but didn't disperse. If anything, it grew larger as people emerged from nearby businesses, drawn by the commotion. The owner of the coffee shop across the street stood in his doorway, phone pressed to his ear, speaking urgently to someone. Lena could feel her heart pounding against her ribs, each beat a reminder of how quickly this situation had spiraled out of control. The torn dress felt like a symbol of something larger, the casual way power could be abused, the fragility of dignity in the face of prejudice. "Officer," she tried again, forcing steel into her voice despite her fear, "you're making a serious mistake." She met his eyes directly, refusing to look away even as his grip threatened to cut off circulation to her arm. A young man stepped forward from the crowd, his hands raised to show he meant no harm. "Man, this isn't right," he said, his voice steady but concerned. "You can't treat people like this." Others murmured in agreement, the collective voice of the crowd growing stronger. Markham's response was to pull Lena roughly toward his patrol car. "You're coming down to the station," he announced, reaching for his handcuffs with his free hand. The metal gleamed in the streetlight, a cold promise of further humiliation. The torn fabric of her dress fluttered in the evening breeze, a reminder of how quickly dignity could be stripped away. But something was building inside Lena, something stronger than fear or humiliation. Years of working in the community, of fighting for others' rights, of standing up against injustice, it all came together in this moment. She straightened her spine, ignoring the pain in her arm where Markham's fingers dug into her flesh. The crowd's energy seemed to flow into her, their collective outrage feeding her courage. She was no longer just Lena Thompson, walking home from a charity event. She was every person who'd ever been stopped without cause, manhandled without justification, judged without reason. More cars were stopping now, their headlights illuminating the scene from different angles. Someone in the crowd was on the phone, their voice carrying clearly through the night air. "Yes, I need to report an officer." "Yes, it's happening right now. He's assaulting a woman on Main Street." The tension in the air was palpable, a living thing that seemed to pulse with each flash of the patrol car's lights. It was clear to everyone watching that this had gone far beyond a routine stop, far beyond anything that could be justified by protocol or procedure. And in that moment, as Markham reached again for his handcuffs, Lena made a decision. She would not be silent. She would not be a victim. She was about to show Officer Markham exactly who he had chosen to harass on this autumn evening. The metallic clink of handcuffs being drawn from Markham's belt was the final straw. Lena felt something shift inside her, a lifetime of carefully maintained composure giving way to righteous anger. The torn dress that hung loosely against her skin became armor rather than a symbol of violation. "Do you even know who I am?" The words came out clear and strong, cutting through the murmurs of the crowd like a knife. Lena had wanted to play this card, had never wanted to be the kind of person who threw around their status, but this wasn't about privilege anymore. This was about power and how it was being abused. Markham's grip on her arm loosened slightly, the first hint of uncertainty crossing his face. But his arrogance quickly reasserted itself. "I don't care who you are," he shot back, though his voice carried a slight tremor that hadn't been there before. "The law applies to everyone equally." The irony of his words wasn't lost on anyone present. A few bitter laughs rose from the crowd, which had grown to nearly 30 people. Phones continued recording, capturing every moment of this confrontation that was rapidly becoming a turning point for both participants. "The law applies equally?" Lena repeated, her voice taking on a tone she usually reserved for addressing city council meetings. "Is this how you apply the law, Officer Markham?" She made a point of reading his nameplate, watching him flinch as she did so. "By accosting women walking home? By destroying private property?" The torn dress rustled in the evening breeze, drawing attention to the damage he'd caused. Someone in the crowd whistled low, and another voice called out, "That's designer, man. Hope you got good insurance." Markham's face reddened, but he tried to maintain his authoritative stance. "Ma'am, if you continue to resist I'm Lena Thompson," she interrupted, her voice carrying to every corner of the gathered crowd. "The mayor's wife." The words hung in the air for a moment before the reaction began. Gasps, whispers, and the unmistakable sound of people realizing they were witnessing something historic. The effect on Markham was immediate and dramatic. His hand dropped from her arm as if she'd suddenly become electrified. He took a step back, his face draining of color so quickly it was visible even in the uneven light of the street lamps and police cruisers still flashing lights. "Mrs. Thompson." Markham's voice had lost all its previous authority, replaced by a stammering uncertainty that made him sound younger, almost childlike. I was just following procedure." "Following procedure?" Lena stepped toward him now, and this time he was the one who backed away. "Is it procedure to profile citizens walking in their own neighborhood? To physically assault them? To destroy their property?" Each question landed like a blow, making him flinch. The crowd had found its voice now, their earlier uncertainty replaced by outrage and determination. "Get his badge number," someone shouted. "I got it all on video," called another. The phones remained up, recording every moment of Markham's humiliation. But Lena wasn't finished. This moment wasn't just about her vindication, it was about something much larger. She turned slightly, making sure her voice would carry to everyone present and to all those who would later see the videos. "This isn't about who I am," she declared, her voice steady and clear. "This is about who we are as a community. Every person walking these streets deserves to be treated with respect and dignity. Every single one." She turned back to Markham, who seemed to be shrinking into himself. "The fact that you only backed down when you learned my identity speaks volumes about how broken this system is." More people were arriving now, drawn by the commotion and the viral nature of modern news. Someone had called local media. A news van was pulling up at the end of the block, its satellite dish visible above the other vehicles. Markham was visibly sweating now, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. He kept glancing between Lena, the crowd, and his patrol car, as if calculating his best escape route. "Mrs. Thompson, please understand. I was just trying to protect the neighborhood." "Protect it from what, exactly?" Lena pressed, her voice carrying a weight of accusation that made him wince. "From well-dressed women walking home? From charity workers? Or was it something else that made you decide I didn't belong here?" The question hung in the air, its implications clear to everyone present. The crowd had grown silent, watching this confrontation that had transformed from a simple police stop into something far more significant, a moment that would be discussed in homes and offices across the city for weeks to come. Through it all, Lena maintained her composure, though inside, she was trembling with a mixture of anger, adrenaline, and an overwhelming sense of responsibility. She knew that tomorrow, this would be more than just a personal incident. It would be a catalyst for change, a moment that could either divide or unite their community. And she was ready for that fight. The transformation in Officer Markham was almost painful to watch. Gone was the swaggering authority figure who had stopped her just minutes ago, replaced by a man who looked like he wanted nothing more than to disappear into thin air. His eyes darted between Lena, the growing crowd, and the news van that was now setting up its equipment. "Mrs. Thompson, I didn't realize." He kept repeating variations of the same phrase, each attempt at an apology falling flatter than the last. His hand moved unconsciously to adjust his collar, as if it had suddenly become too tight. Lena watched him, feeling a complex mix of emotions she couldn't quite sort out. The satisfaction of seeing him squirm ward with a deeper, more troubling realization. His reaction, this sudden, dramatic shift in behavior, highlighted everything wrong with the situation. The crowd had grown more vocal now, their earlier uncertainty replaced with righteous anger. "Suspend him," someone shouted. "We got it all on video," called another. Phones were still recording, capturing every moment of Markham's downfall. Some people were already posting to social media. Lena could hear them narrating what they'd witnessed. A young reporter from the local news station was pushing through the crowd, microphone in hand, her cameraman following close behind. "Mrs. Thompson, can we get a statement about what happened here?" The professional mask couldn't quite hide the excitement in her voice. This was the kind of story that could make a career. But Lena wasn't ready to make this a media circus, not yet. This moment needed to be about more than just headlines and viral videos. She held up a hand to stop the reporter, her eyes still fixed on Markham. "Officer," she said, her voice carrying clearly despite its quiet tone, "I want you to look around. Look at all these people watching. Look at how quickly everything changed when you learned who I was." She gestured to her torn dress, the designer label now visible through the rip. "This dress cost more than most people make in a week. But its price tag shouldn't determine how I'm treated. My title shouldn't determine whether I deserve respect." Markham's face had taken on an ashen quality, the reality of his situation finally sinking in. His career, his reputation, everything he'd built over years of service. It was all hanging by a thread, and he knew it. The crowd's angry murmurs had become a constant backdrop, like waves crashing against a shore. People were still arriving, drawn by the commotion and the presence of news media. The street had become a stage, with Lena and Markham as the unwitting performers in a drama about power, prejudice, and privilege. The police cruiser's lights continued to flash, creating an almost theatrical lighting effect. "I'm sorry," Markham finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was just trying to do my job." The words hung in the air, hollow and inadequate. Someone in the crowd laughed bitterly, and others joined in, the sound carrying a sharp edge of derision. Lena felt the victory settle over her like a heavy cloak, but it brought no warmth, no real satisfaction. Yes, she had won this confrontation. Yes, Markham would face consequences for his actions. But what about tomorrow? What about the countless others who faced similar treatment but lacked the shield of status and privilege? The news camera was rolling now, capturing everything. Somewhere in the crowd, she heard someone say, "Wait till the mayor sees this." The mention of Richard brought a fresh wave of emotion, not because she needed his protection, but because she knew how this would affect him, how it would impact their work in the community. More police cars were arriving, probably called by concerned citizens, or maybe by Markham himself before he realized who she was. The arriving officers took in the scene with professional wariness. The crowd, the media, their colleagues standing defeated before the mayor's wife. One of them, a sergeant Lena recognized from community meetings, approached carefully. "Mrs. Thompson, are you all right? Do you need medical attention?" His tone was perfectly respectful, almost apologetic, and somehow that made everything worse. She looked down at her arm where Markham had grabbed her, already seeing the beginnings of bruises forming. But the physical marks seemed trivial compared to the deeper wounds this incident had revealed. The casual prejudice, the arbitrary application of power, the stark reality that status was still a shield against injustice. The crowd was growing restless, demanding immediate action. Some were calling for Markham's badge, others were sharing their own stories of police encounters. The incident was transforming in real time from a personal confrontation into a symbol of larger systemic issues. Lena felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. She couldn't just walk away from this, couldn't treat it as a personal victory and move on. The torn dress, the bruised arm, the shaken dignity, these weren't just her injuries anymore. They belonged to everyone who had ever been judged, stopped, or harassed because they didn't fit someone's idea of who belonged where. The hollow victory tasted like ashes in her mouth, but maybe, just maybe, it could be transformed into something more meaningful. As she watched Markham being led aside by his sergeant, Lena began to see beyond the immediate moment to the larger battle ahead. Officer Markham's attempts at apology continued to fall from his lips, each word seeming more desperate than the last. "Mrs. Thompson, please."
I was just doing my job.
"If I'd known who you were." He trailed off, perhaps finally realizing how his words only made things worse. Lena stood there, feeling the evening air cool against her skin through the torn fabric of her dress. Each breath she took seemed to carry the weight of responsibility, of knowing that this moment could either become just another incident report or something that sparked real change. The crowd had grown larger still, with people sharing what they'd witnessed through live streams and social media. Phones glowed like fireflies in the gathering darkness, their cameras capturing every word, every gesture, every moment of this unfolding drama. Somewhere in the background, she could hear a news reporter doing a live stand-up, turning her personal humiliation into tomorrow's headline. "That's exactly the problem, Officer Markham," Lena finally said, her voice carrying clearly across the now hushed crowd. "You shouldn't need to know who I am to treat me with basic human dignity." She gestured to her torn dress, the designer label now visible through the rip. "This dress shouldn't be a reason for suspicion. My appearance shouldn't determine whether I deserve respect." A young woman stepped forward from the crowd, her hands trembling slightly as she spoke. "Last month, the same thing happened to my sister," she said. "But she's not married to anyone important." Nobody cared when she complained. Others began nodding, murmuring their own stories of similar encounters. Lena felt each word like a physical blow. The protection her status had ultimately provided her was a stark reminder of how many others lacked such shields. The torn dress suddenly felt like a symbol of something far larger, the tattered state of trust between law enforcement and the community they were meant to serve. The sergeant who had arrived on scene was still hovering nearby, clearly uncertain how to handle this increasingly public situation. Other officers maintained a perimeter, keeping the growing crowd at a distance while trying to look busy with their notepads and radios. "Your badge number," Lena said to Markham, her voice steady. "For the record." She didn't need it. The incident would be well documented by dozens of videos and witness statements, but she wanted him to say it, wanted it to be part of the official record in his own voice. Markham recited his badge number mechanically, his earlier arrogance completely deflated. The crowd recorded it, dozens of phones capturing the moment. Someone nearby was already typing it into a social media post, the soft tapping of their screen adding to the night's soundtrack. "I want everyone here to remember something," Lena addressed the crowd, turning to face them fully. "This isn't just about me. This isn't just about one officer or one incident." She paused, making eye contact with as many people as she could. "This is about every person who's ever been stopped without cause, questioned without reason, treated with suspicion because of how they look or what they're wearing." The news reporter had edged closer, her microphone extended, hungry for sound bites. But Lena wasn't performing for the cameras. Her words were for the community members gathered around her, for the people who lived this reality every day. "We talk about respect like it's something that needs to be earned," she continued, her voice growing stronger. "But basic human dignity? That should be a given. It shouldn't depend on your clothes, your title, or who you're married to." The bruises on her arm were beginning to throb, a physical reminder of how quickly the situation had escalated. But the pain felt almost necessary now, a connection to everyone who'd ever suffered similar treatment without the protection of status or privilege. More stories were emerging from the crowd. A middle-aged man described being followed through his own neighborhood. A college student talked about being stopped 3 times in 1 week. Each account added to the weight of the moment, turning one incident into a chorus of shared experiences. Markham stood silently now, his presence almost forgotten as the gathering transformed into something larger, a spontaneous community forum on police conduct and civil rights. The sergeant looked increasingly uncomfortable, probably wondering how this would play out in tomorrow's media coverage. "Tomorrow," Lena said, her voice cutting through the murmur of conversations, "this incident will be news. People will talk about how the mayor's wife was profiled and harassed. They'll focus on my torn dress, on Officer Markham's behavior, on the dramatic moment when he realized who I was. She shook her head slowly. But that's not the real story here. The crowd grew quiet, waiting. Even the news crew had stopped their side commentary, caught up in the gravity of the moment. Lena looked at her phone, saw the missed calls from Richard, knew that soon she'd have to deal with the political fallout of all this. But right now, in this moment, she had something more important to say. The real story is that this happens every day to people who don't have the protection of a title. People who can't make the news stop and listen. People whose stories get dismissed or ignored. She turned back to Markham, who seemed to shrink under her gaze. That's the true cost of the respect you showed me only after learning my name. The walk home felt different now. Each step carried the weight of everything that had happened. Every eye that followed her progress belonged to someone who had witnessed her transformation from victim to voice of change. The torn dress rustled with each movement, a constant reminder that this night had altered more than just fabric. Lena's phone hadn't stopped buzzing. Messages from Richard, from her assistant Sarah, from city council members who had already gotten wind of the incident. The news traveled fast in their city, especially when it involved the mayor's wife being manhandled by law enforcement. She responded only to Richard's messages, letting him know she was okay and on her way home. The crowd had begun to disperse, though not before exchanging contact information, making plans, turning a moment of shared outrage into the beginnings of organized action. Some offered to walk with her, but Lena politely declined. She needed these moments alone, needed to process everything that had happened. The same streets that had felt so familiar earlier now seemed different, charged with new meaning. She passed the coffee shop where the owner had called for help, the storefront windows where people had pressed their faces against the glass to witness the confrontation. Each landmark had become part of a larger story. Her arm ached where Markham had grabbed her, the bruises already darkening against her skin. She'd refused medical attention, not out of pride, but because she knew there were people in their city who couldn't afford to seek treatment for similar injuries. The pain felt like a connection to them, a physical reminder of the work that needed to be done. As she rounded the corner onto their street, Lena saw the lights on in their home. Knew Richard would be waiting, probably pacing in his study as he made calls and tried to get ahead of the situation. The political implications would be significant. His administration had already been working on police reform, but this would accelerate everything. The security guard at their gate tried to hide his reaction to her appearance, but she caught the flash of concern in his eyes. "Mrs. Thompson," he said, quickly opening the gate. "The mayor's been asking about you. Do you need anything? Should I call someone?" "I'm fine, James," she assured him, managing a small smile. "But thank you." She paused, then added, "Your daughter, she's still in the police academy, right?" When he nodded, she continued, "Make sure she sees the videos from tonight. Make sure she understands what power really means." Richard met her at the door, his face a mixture of concern, anger, and something else, pride, maybe. He reached for her, careful of her injured arm, which someone had obviously told him about. "Lena," he started, but she shook her head, stopping him. "We need to talk," she said, her voice firm. "Not about me, not about what happened to me. About what happens next." She moved past him into the house, heading for his study where she knew they could have a real conversation. The study was exactly as she'd expected, papers everywhere, multiple tablets showing news websites, his phone lighting up with messages. The incident was already trending on social media, videos being shared, comment sections filling up with opinions and debates. "I've got the police chief on hold," Richard said, following her in. "The commissioner wants to meet first thing tomorrow. The press is asking for statements." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she recognized from countless late-night crisis meetings. "Tell me what you need. Whatever you want to do about this. I'm behind you." Lena picked up one of the tablets, scanning the headlines that were already appearing. "Officer confronts mayor's wife. Police stop goes wrong. Viral video shows police harassment." They all missed the point, focused on her title, her status, the scandal of it all. "What I need," she said slowly, setting the tablet down, "is for you to listen. Not as my husband, not as the mayor, but as someone who can actually change things. She met his eyes, saw him recognize the determination in her expression. This isn't about me getting an apology or Officer Markham being suspended. This is about something much bigger. Richard nodded, moving to sit behind his desk. He pulled out a legal pad, old school, like always, and picked up his pen. "Tell me everything," he said. "Not just what happened tonight, but what needs to happen next." And so she did. She told him about the other stories she'd heard in the crowd, about the woman whose sister had faced similar treatment, about the college student stopped multiple times in his own neighborhood. She talked about the look in Markham's eyes when he realized who she was, about how quickly respect had replaced suspicion. "We need more than just sensitivity training," she said, pacing the study as ideas flowed. "We need accountability, transparency, real community oversight." She stopped, turning to face him. "And I want to lead it, not as the mayor's wife, but as someone who's seen both sides of this, the privilege that protects and the prejudice that wounds." Richard was taking notes, but he could see in his eyes that he understood. This wasn't just about damage control or political maneuvering. This was about using what had happened to create real, lasting change. The weeks following the incident transformed Lena's life in ways she hadn't expected. Her torn designer dress, carefully preserved as evidence, became a symbol that appeared in news coverage and social media posts. But Lena herself had changed far more than her wardrobe. Her voice had found new purpose, her mission a clearer focus. The conference room at City Hall buzzed with energy as community leaders gathered for what had become regular strategy sessions. Today's meeting was about implementing new oversight procedures for the police department, but it represented something larger, a shift in how the city approached law enforcement and community relations. "We've got support from 6 council members now," Sarah reported, sliding a document across the table to Lena. "The Community Review Board proposal is gaining traction." Her assistant had taken on additional responsibilities, helping coordinate the growing movement that had sprung from that night's confrontation. Lena scanned the document, noting the signatures and proposed amendments. The bruises on her arm had faded weeks ago, but the momentum for change had only grown stronger. Every day, more stories emerged, people sharing their experiences, offering their support, wanting to be part of the solution. "What about the training program?" she asked, looking up at the diverse group gathered around the table. Community organizers, legal experts, former law enforcement officers who believed in reform, they'd all come together, drawn by the possibility of real change. Maria Rodriguez, a local activist who'd become one of Lena's closest allies, pulled up a presentation on her laptop. "We've developed a comprehensive curriculum," she explained. "It goes beyond traditional sensitivity training. We're talking about real community engagement, understanding implicit bias, de-escalation techniques that actually work." The walls of the conference room were covered with charts and graphs, data about police stops, arrest rates, community complaints. Numbers that had always existed but had never received this level of scrutiny. Each statistic represented countless stories like Lena's, but with different endings. Officer Markham's face still appeared occasionally in the news, his suspension and subsequent resignation serving as a talking point in larger discussions about police accountability. But Lena rarely thought about him now. Her focus had shifted from that single encounter to the broader patterns it represented. "Mrs. Thompson?" A young police cadet raised her hand from the back of the room, part of a new initiative to involve trainees in community discussions before they hit the streets. "Can I ask why you didn't just press charges and move on? Why take on all of this?" The room grew quiet. It was a question Lena had heard before in various forms. Some people expected her to be satisfied with Markham's resignation, with the department's official apology, with the policy changes already implemented. They didn't understand that those were just the beginning, because moving on would have been a betrayal. Lena answered, her voice carrying the conviction of someone who had found their true calling. "Not just of the people who face discrimination every day, but of everything I believe about what our community can become." Richard appeared in the doorway, catching her eye. He'd been amazingly supportive, understanding when she stepped back from some of her traditional mayoral wife duties to focus on this work. He saw what others were beginning to see, that Lena had found her own path to serving their city. The meeting continued, plans taking shape for new training protocols, community oversight mechanisms, transparency initiatives. But it wasn't just about policies and procedures anymore. It was about changing the culture, rebuilding trust, creating a model that other cities might follow. Later that evening, walking home along the same streets where everything had changed, Lena passed the spot where Markham had stopped her. The memory no longer carried the sting of humiliation. Instead, it reminded her of how a moment of injustice had sparked a movement for change. Her phone buzzed with messages from community members, updates on projects, news about similar initiatives starting in other cities. What had begun as one woman's confrontation with prejudice had grown into something much larger, a collaborative effort to ensure that respect wasn't determined by status or appearance. The sunset painted the city in warm colors, highlighting the mix of old and new buildings that lined the streets. Lena saw it all differently now, not just as the mayor's wife, not just as a victim of profiling, but as someone working to make these streets safer and more just for everyone who walked them. She stopped at the community center where her journey had begun that fateful night. A new sign hung outside, announcing upcoming town halls and training sessions. Inside, she could see people gathering for another meeting, another step toward change. The torn dress hung in her closet now, preserved not as a reminder of victimhood, but as a symbol of transformation. Lena Thompson had walked these streets that night as the mayor's wife, but she walked them now as something more, a leader in her own right, a voice for change, a woman who had turned a moment of injustice into a movement for justice. The city was changing, slowly but surely, and so was she. Each step forward carried the weight of responsibility, the hope of progress, and the understanding that real change required more than just policies and procedures. It required heart, persistence, and the courage to stand up not just for oneself, but for all those who needed a voice.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.